Hello and welcome to week 2 of the Captain's Run. I'm here with the Buffaloes team and they have had a fantastic week. Their captain has also had a stellar win, so it's going to be a really, really great Captain's Run. But one of the things I'd like to do before we start anything else is hand over to Jenna, the captain of the Buffaloes, to say a few words before we introduce Dave Christensen.
Super. Thanks so much, Cyrus. Thanks to the rest of the Buffalo team that have joined us today. It's always great to be able to see you guys. It has been a good week. We're a few matches behind, so don't worry about what the point systems are looking like. But I know, if I can speak on behalf of all of my team with Dave, that we're very excited. We had a great Captain's Run last Friday. It's just so wonderful to learn so much more about what's happening in Africa and around us.
I'm going to hand over to Dave and he's going to talk us through the topic this week. Over to you, Dave.
Thank you very much, Cyrus. Welcome all you guys. The biggest threat to conservation today is the loss of habitat. And obviously that it's a very broad subject. The human population of the world is now more than 7.5 billion people. And essentially the competition for space can be broken down into probably 5 different land uses. The first one is obviously human settlement, things like towns and cities and things like that, and all the amenities that are surrounded sustaining human life. The second one is obviously agriculture, which is the way in which we feed that population. And as populations grow in cities and things like that, there's a greater need for commercial agriculture. Then there's mining, which is the third big one, which has a fairly major form of land use. Logging of natural forests, which is the fourth one. And then the fifth one is obviously wildlife areas. And so given those 5 different land uses, I just want to pose the question to you guys, the players, and I'm sure that you've had a little bit of an opportunity to sort of think about some of these issues. What do you think the problems are relating to those 5 different land uses?
I mean, I actually hadn't, for me, always the first thing that would pop out would be human settlement and agriculture, just the common ones I would think of. But actually looking at this list, it's obviously so much bigger. And I suppose as our population is getting bigger, everybody in every aspect is expanding. So this just means those 5 categories are, it doesn't seem like probably one is expanding more than the other. They probably all lead to expansion all at the same time, which must be, very tricky. The more settlement, the more mining, agricultural space, and that's just obviously all eating into habitat area. And as human population, unfortunately, we're just getting bigger and greedier, so we want more. So more cities being built, more towns, it just spirals.
I see Ken also had a point as well.
The mining and the logging to me seems like something where we're taken away from what's there, right? A lot of the open cast mining and the logging, nothing's being done to make that land use viable after the logging and the mining is done. So it's a one-use sort of deal. And that seems to be a big deal over here in the States. The logging and stuff, especially up in the Northern Territories, it's unbelievable what's done up there. So, finding some way to force those companies to maybe make that land use viable afterwards.
I think Matthew, you also had one point.
Yeah, I was going to add. So obviously, one of the main things in terms of settlement is there's overpopulation. So unless that gets under control, that's just going to continue to grow forever, and that's obviously that then has the impact where that it then bumps onto everything else. You've got more people, you need more mining, you need more agricultural. There's more logging happening. So that's the first point that I think is a real big issue in this whole habitat losses. Obviously, we are the cause, but we're also the only solution. We need to come up with the solutions.
That's
but I mean, moving on, looking also at the mining, the issue there is obviously that people want natural resources. We need natural resources to be able to do certain things. And that's, I suppose, also in terms of combating things, maybe we look at, that's where the renewable energy sources come in, and what can replace with what the mining sector is doing. Because obviously the human settlement stuff, so we are clearing habitats so that we can make way for mining or make way for urban development so that we can live in these areas and use them. And as you said, Ken, you were saying the problem is it's a one-time use for some of them. It is, especially on the mining sector. I know in Zim for a long time, sort of back in the early 90s, there was a big drive to try and do reclamation of mine dumps. But the problem therein is that that habitat and all those ecosystems that live there are already destroyed. So yes, you're reclaiming it and you're creating a new sort of environmental habitat, but it's not the habitat that should have been there in the first place. So you've still lost that. You've just replaced it with something else. So yeah, I think the biggest issue though is overpopulation is the main cause, and then that just knocks onto everything else after that.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, you basically hit the nail on the head. So what I would like to do is I'd just like to go back a step and look at, you know, the biggest threat to conservation, particularly in countries like Africa, which still has some fairly large swathes of wild land available to it. If you look at the population statistics of Africa, Africa's population is doubling about every 20 years. So it means that our current population is 1.34 million. In 20 years' time, it's going to be more than 2.5 million, and so on. So this is basically an unsustainable growth rate. If you look at Europe, where the population is actually not even a billion people, the reason for that is that over time, people have realized the benefit of having smaller families, being able to educate them better, giving them better opportunities in life. And, you know, what does that do? As soon as you have a family only having 2 children, it actually generates a negative birth rate. So that's where Europe are now. If you go to places like, I was recently in South Luangwa in Zambia, and there's still a lot of people working in the camps and in the tourism industry there that live outside the park that are still having as many as up to 8 children. Now, that is just not a sustainable figure. And if you start breaking it down and looking at, you know, why are people having big families? Well, it's very, very common in a lot of these very rural places for people to first of all say, oh, well, you know, it's our custom, it's our tradition to have large families. Not really thinking about the fact that the reason why their ancestors had large families was for the simple reason that before modern medicine was brought to this part of the world, people would have very large families, but more than half of those children wouldn't survive because of disease. Now you introduce modern medicine, it takes away, you know, the death rate. So now suddenly, instead of having 8 children because maybe 3 or 4 of them would survive, suddenly you're having 8 children and 7 of them are surviving. Then there's the other issue that in some of these rural areas where people are poor and they have a small scale farm, they're poor, they can't afford labor to help them work on those farms. So what do? The next thing is to have children, because those children can help them work on the farm. That is labor that all you basically have to do. You don't give them a salary, you just give them food in their belly and the problem is solved. So these, I think, are some of the major contributing factors towards the population growth in Africa. I don't know if any of you guys have any other take on that.
Yeah, I agree with you there, David, about the labor. And you'll find this in all the small agricultural communities, especially around Harare. And I'll give an example of Mount Hampton, where you've got a lot of farms around that area. And what normally happens is because people want to make more from the farm, they have more kids because that means there's more income coming into that family. So they put all those people together. If it's a family of 8, all 8 people will be employed at that farm, and all of them make money from that farm, and it comes back into this one pot, which is that family. And I'll also want to say something about what Matt said about urban development. And I'll give a few examples of cases I've seen around Zimbabwe, stuff like that happening, where it's impacted on wildlife habitats. And I'll give an example of places like Harare, for example. We're building outwards. And now Harare has gone as far as Norton, if you look at it, as it normally didn't have to go that far. And a place like Mashingu has gone further out. It's almost reaching Chiredzi. And there's a wildlife park called Nyanda Game Lodge. People have been resettled into that game park. And now that means the animals that were there had to be sold or had to be killed, which has impacted on wildlife habitats there and in Harare as well. Because now where you had the snake park, maybe in 5 years' time, you probably won't have it because a lot of suburbs are going towards Lake Chiveru, which no one's really thinking about what's going to happen to those animals that are around that area. So they'll have less space to feed off and less space to grow and all that, because we're only focusing on urban development and people and resettling them, and we're not thinking of building upwards, which is what we probably need to start doing as a country, as opposed to building outwards. Over.
I think Matt has a question.
I just wanted to add on to that in terms of the overpopulation and the talking about having more children in terms of a family, in terms of Africa and culture within here. One of the things we have in Botswana is that when people move into a new house or they build land, the first thing that they do is they chop down all the trees. Now, I don't know why, but it's something that's done across the board. It's done out in the rural areas, and it's done also even in town. I have neighbors that move into new houses that buy them, and the first thing they do is they chop down the 200 or 300-year-old tree in the yard. So, yeah, it's a problem. And talking about having you have a bigger family so that you can utilize the land. What also happens there, I'm sure, Dave, you'll probably also tell us that then they overexploit that land. They use it until they can't use it anymore, and it becomes barren and nothing else will grow there.
I see
Very
Ken
much
also
so,
had a
Matt.
point as well.
Yeah, I'd like to piggyback on Langton over there. You know, one of the things we see in the States here, and obviously, you know, it's a little bit different, but the cities have grown so much and everybody's trying to move further away from the center of town. And then the center of town becomes an area that's completely unused, right? And the city's grown outward. And the reality is there's a bunch of space in the middle that's just forgotten about, right? It's become the inner city. It's not a place anyone wants to be. And it's just a complete waste of time or waste of space. And it's never going to get used again unless you force it to be used. So that was the first thing. And the second thing is, you know, I feel like if we listen to nature, whether it's AIDS and HIV or it's COVID-19, it's telling us something, right? And it's trying to control the population, and unfortunately, maybe some of the time we're too smart for that.
Well, with all of those comments, I think we're going to hand it over to Dave to just sort of carry on running through some of the points that he's made, because I totally agree with you, Ken, that there seems to be something that we're sort of missing in terms of interpreting what the signs are. And perhaps, you know, it has to do with, you know, taking care of the environments that we're encroaching on. Dave, is this something that you agree with?
Very much so, Cyrus. And, you know, what I'd really like to point out here is that, you know, essentially, as was mentioned before, we are the problem, but we are also the only solution. And so when it comes to sort of conservation or the environment, as we're talking, I guess now primarily about sort of wildlife areas, you know, that is the single portion of land use that's being eroded while all the others are basically growing. And so it is more vital now than ever that we actually start doing something about, finding solutions to ensure that we don't, wipe it out completely. And to me, there's only one solution, and that is education. That is the key. It's the only solution to the problem. And when you talk about sort of growing populations and you talk about an impoverished community, what do we do for those people to allow them to start to value those areas? And the only way that they can start to value that is if they move off the bottom of Maslow's hierarchies of needs and start moving up the ladder. And in order to do that, the education process needs to come in, and there also we need to find viable alternatives to the land use for these people. So like, for example, if you're a small scale farmer and you have 6 children so that you've got labor to help you work in the farm, what's going to happen is that those 6 children, you're not going to have enough disposable income to send all of those 6 children to school. And so that cycle of poverty is just going to completely repeat itself over and over and over again. So what needs to happen is, conservation initiatives, I believe, need to start including systems that improve the quality of life of these people. So like, for example, if the guy has, like, one of the biggest problems to deforestation in this country is the tobacco industry, where once the tobacco farm or once the commercial farms were lost, what happened was tobacco companies encouraged small scale farmers to now grow tobacco to fill that void, which was fine. And actually their production came up and actually met the targets that were being put out by commercial farmers previously. But what the small scale tobacco farmers weren't given, they were given money to help them with their inputs, but they were never given enough money to be able to afford coal. And even because they're such small scale farmers, the amount of money that they made from that small crop didn't actually allow them enough income to be able to buy coal themselves and use that for curing. So what did they do? They went straight out to their backyard. They cut down 300-year-old Brachystegia trees and used that to cure. And within 3 years, they were left with a desert behind them. There was nothing. They never planted trees behind them. They never did anything. And within 3 years, it was gone. And then they've got no way of curing their tobacco. And they're in a far worse situation than they were when they started. So at the end of the day, the bottom line is we need to find alternatives for these guys. So if you're living on the edge of a park and you're using that park to obtain your firewood, what alternative have you got to be able to heat your home or do your cooking or things like that? That's where we need to have governments be able to subsidize things like paraffin so people can use that for cooking. Develop things like biogas so that people have got a cheap alternative of fuels to be able to cook their food and to be able to sustain themselves, basically. So really, it all boils down to education at the end of the day.
I love that point, David. And I think the incredible thing about this, though, is that you mentioned one thing in particular, cheap alternatives to what is out there. And perhaps the education is critical to trying to get to that understanding. But then you might get people firing back with, but the trees are free. That's even better than cheap. And so,
while they're there.
Exactly.
And then when they're gone, what do you do?
And I suppose this is where your point around education comes in the sense that by educating people that you need to then replant if you're going to cut something down, that's something that needs to happen. But is the onus then on the people to try and source the seeds or the trees or the saplings? And is this a space where government could get involved?
Well, I believe that it is their responsibility. What I always say to people is that the best time to plant a tree was 30 years ago. The next best time to plant a tree is today. So, you know, it's never too late. I mean, if we can, I think on this group, I posted a thing about the forest man in India. I don't know if you guys saw that clip. I mean, just a remarkable human being that saw something that was in a, you know, very terrible shape. And he's dedicated his entire life to planting trees. And there's wildlife there now. There's, you know, it's remarkable what one single person has done. So, you know, we always like to think, oh, well, you know, I'm just one person in 7 billion. What difference am I going to make? You actually can make a difference. And if everybody starts thinking like that, and I think more so for those of us that are involved in dealing with people, and if we are, you know, celebrities, if we sportsmen and people like that, we have a much bigger reach than what we ever even can imagine. And I think that every single individual can make a difference.
Yeah, Dave, thank you for your time. You know, I do a lot of work. I'm in the mining industry, so you're going to curse me, but I do a lot of work in the DRC and Zambia, and driving those countries. Unlike Zim, where the energy comes from paraffin, most of it. In those countries, it's just bags and bags of charcoal sold on the side of the road. It's actually unbelievable how much charcoal is traded in those countries. And like Cyrus was saying, it's free. You know, it's free. And like I said, when I in my quiz game the other day, I said numbers of threatened species is at an all-time high. And the natural world needs all of us to help. You know, like you spoke about education, imagine the world population was taught about the principle of protecting our plants, protecting our animals and our natural areas. And then imagine the world was all living together without the 7 deadly sins, which is something like greed, you know, gluttony, pride. We'd all be enjoying the privileges of our natural world together, you know, so I don't know what the solution is. You know, Elon Musk maybe needs to quicken that process of sending settlers to Mars, but education seems to be something, you know, growing population, you know, you're running out of space. You know, I don't know what to suggest.
And I love that point. I mean, okay, obviously we might not be enlisting Elon Musk to send all of us to Mars, but maybe just a few rebel rousers to begin with. But I think that, and to your point, Adrian, you know, one of the critical things here is that sometimes it does feel a little disempowering, because in essence, there are so many of us, and what are you going to do? Turn around to somebody and say, okay, please disappear. But there are solutions in our hands as well. And I know, Dave, you mentioned education, but that also then leads to development of different tools, and people saying, okay, how do we work within the environments that we live in? And I suppose that's the point you were making earlier.
Well, yeah, and you know, I think the key is to actually make that wildlife land valuable. That is what is key. I mean, bring value to those you know, those areas, to those animals, to that wildlife. And if you bring value to those areas, then that is going to basically prevent people from encroaching on those areas for whatever means, whether it's mining or agriculture or whatever, because they're going to say, oh, we can't afford to touch that because it's too valuable. And we really do need these. I mean, you see it more and more in people from the first world who live in areas where much of the nature around them has actually been destroyed through, you know, population growth. In Europe as a classic example. And for those people, what is the first thing they do when they get an opportunity to get away from work? They want to get back into nature, because they've now realized that without nature, we are fundamentally dead anyway. We need that to feed our soul. You know, that then brings, of course, the complex thing about the land use of these wild areas. And I'm talking about Africa in particular, where, you know, people are poor and people do rely on those resources. So everyone's competing for the same resources. Making them economically important is more and more important. And those people need to benefit from those areas as well, in terms of jobs and in terms of opportunities to be able to feed themselves and give them what they need to sustain their lives. And not all areas are equal. So some areas are going to be far better for doing non-consumptive tourism, where people can go and sit and look at game and enjoy it and that sort of thing. Other areas are lower rainfall, the terrain is too harsh, they're too inaccessible. And so the percentage of visitation they get basically compromises their economic viability if you try to do a non-consumptive type model in those areas. Then in those areas, consumptive tourism is better. And it can, you know, we were talking earlier before the program and just discussing how for a lot of people, you know, people will try and justify and say, oh no, but hunting is important, conservation thing. Hunting is not conservation. But hunting is, if it's used sustainably and ethically, is a very good business model for economic viability of areas that wouldn't otherwise really be viable as wildlife areas, and they'd be turned into the cow and the plow. So, you know, and a lot of those areas aren't even very good for agriculture either. So, you know, then you start ending up with an area that's been degraded because it's been overutilized for the wrong reason. So there are different business models, and there's, you know, it's not a simple fix. It's not a simple solution. Every area is different. You're dealing with different people's cultures. You're dealing with different people's circumstances. There's not an easy fix, but I believe fundamentally what it boils down to is education, particularly of people that are uneducated. I mean, imagine someone who lives in an area where his entire life, all he's ever done is cut down a tree in order to cook his food. And now suddenly the trees are gone. What alternative does he have? And it's amazing where, you know, you can educate people, and things like these biogas things, which are really, really cheap to produce biogas. All you need is a couple of cows, a couple of plastic barrels, a little bit of hose pipe, and you can actually make a little gas stove that works off biogas that's completely free. So, you know, it can cost you maybe $50 to set up a little biogas digester, and then you have, you know, free cooking gas for the rest of your life. But unless you know how, unless you've been taught how to do that and how to use that, how would you know? So education is the key to getting, you know, and until these people's lives start improving, the quality of their lives start improving, and until they start getting up onto the next levels of Maslow's hierarchy, their attitude will never change. So to me, the key, when you talk about anti-poaching, and that's the first thing that comes to people's minds when you talk about conservation, they think about anti-poaching. That's a very short-term solution, and it's just putting a band-aid on the problem. But it's not addressing the cause of the problem. So until you start addressing the cause of the problem, conservation, as you know, in the true sense, will never happen.
I don't have anything profound to say this time around. I think it's all been said, but there's some, at the risk of repeating myself, there's some themes that come back from last week, and it's how much of the challenge we face in the conservation world are linked to, I think, as Adrian said, corporate greed and the risk of corruption that can come from that. And, you know, us sitting in this forum now can very easily go and make a cup of tea or coffee and put the switch on or put the gas stove on and be boiling water in it. We take for granted how easy that is, but in 95% of Africa, that involves carrying a bundle of firewood from a place that's provided it or still has wood. You've carried it a long way, and then you've made a small, wood burning fire, and you've a cup of tea is probably a luxury for a lot of people, because that energy is prioritized against cooking food. So I think I would like to see, I guess, globally more of a shift in terms of, as you say, stop rapid firing band-aids from the hip with all these short-term solutions, and actually start going to the real root cause of these challenges, because we're dealing with all the symptoms that are coming out from an underlying sickness. I think that is the plight of conservation in Southern Africa. And unfortunately, we're the continent with the greatest value of resources by far, but we're also the one that seems to be, the basket case of a continent in terms of managing those resources in a manner that is exemplary. So very quickly, talking about, I saw an article recently, every 6 seconds we've lost a football field worth of forest around the world. That was in 2019. And Romania, I've ridden motorcycles in Romania. Romania used to be one of the most wild and rugged parts of Europe, with bears and home to various species of wolf. And if you look at it now, I mean, it's all been turned into pasture land, same as Europe, the British Isles. And I think we're in the middle of that. So there's a chance for the world to see that that's going to be the reality for Southern Africa. But I don't, without being negative, I'm always looking for the positives. But I think we've got to change the narrative from short-term solutions, anti-poaching, rehabilitating areas. We talk all this terminology of stressed environments, stressed ecosystems. Only thing stressing them is man. So, we've got to take a step back and say, look, nature's got a pretty good way of managing itself. But, going back to my analogy of the Zambezi Valley, we irreparably changed that landscape of minor pools the day we put a huge big dam wall for ATP power. So, everything we do, there's a follow-on effect. And I think sometimes in the grand scheme of the world, 100 years is a millisecond, and we're living through that in our lifetime. So, it's my hope that the likes of FFI and African Parks and, National Geographic and all these champions and crusaders of conservation, possibly less focus on boot polish and military parades or parades in the morning, and more focus on international policy and lobby. If we've got Prince Harry, who's a president of African Parks, then it's all those European companies that need to take some education and swallow a pill about the damages of their relentless demand for raw materials that come out of places like Congo. And if you had the history that the Congo's had, I mean, you're desperate for any help, and you're not in a position to question whether it's morally or ethically or environmentally sound, and corporate citizenship and best practice is not something that's on the top of your agenda for the day. It's probably staying alive and working out where your next meals come from. And very quickly, at the rate we're going, Zimbabwe is going to find itself in a similar boat where we just give off our resources. So I think, to leave it at that, I think the narrative around conservation has got to change from window dressing and fixing symptoms to actually taking it between the eyes and understand what the real problem is.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, Graham obviously spoke about policy and whatever, so I was just going to say, in terms of scope for legislation, so not just the education, but actually putting in place some legislation within Africa specifically that talks about conservation and education, because I don't think there's much in terms of our governments that actually demands that you in your school area, for instance, actually educate the kids on conservation. It's not a hard push for something like a conservation in terms of a conservation topic, or something that's taught at basic education level that could be done. And maybe legislation needs to look at trying to impose something like that. There's a few of us, and if we started driving that kind of thing, I think it's something that's easily viable. And you got to start down there at the kid level, at the youngsters, because that's where they're going to be the ones carrying this through.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%, Matt. I think that's a very valid point, and I think the education is definitely lacking. And if we can influence our own kids and a couple of people around us, but really, I agree 100%. It's something that the government should be driving big time, and ensuring that this becomes a major part of the curriculum. The sooner people realize that we actually only have one Earth, the better. A lot of people just think that they can just carry on doing what they're doing and there'll be no consequence to it. There's always a consequence to it. And unfortunately, the negative consequences growing at such an exponential rate that if we don't start really getting down to the cause and fixing the problem, we are going to be the next, great extinction for sure.
I'm really, really grateful for all of you being on this call and such great feedback from you, Dave, and from all of you. So I'm going to ask you guys all to do me a favor. If you don't mind all unmuting your microphones for a second, because I think, we'll get to the sort of end of the discussion phase now. And what I'd like to do is to thank David, to thank all of your teammates, and also to do a little bit of a hand clap for all of the people on the front line of the conservation efforts all across the world at the moment. So if you don't mind joining me in a little bit of a hand clap. You guys were really, really superb. It was a fantastic captain's run today. And I just think that with the level of information that we all share in forums like this, we can make a huge difference too. Congratulations to you all.
I think, that's what this platform is about. That's why we set it up. Two major things came out from today for me. One, obviously, education needs to increase massively to the youngsters, because they're inheriting this mess from us. And secondly, that we can all make a difference, and this sort of feeling that someone else is going to do it, that's their job. Those are the conservation people. They're over there. They can sort that issue out whilst we sort out our thing over here. We can't continue to think like that. And that's also one of the reasons why we set this up, to give people an opportunity to first of all, to grow their own awareness, and to secondly, start contributing, even in a small way, even if it's getting a wormery in your back garden, or thinking twice before you use a plastic bottle again. Those things all add up and make a difference. But more importantly, we've got sporting legends and icons here, and you all have influence. You all are leaders in your communities. You all have your own audiences. You can really champion this thing. So next time you're out there and you're on the sports field, or you're riding a bike across the Sahara, and you guys are going to be able to influence people on your way, and just keep it in your thinking. But thanks very much indeed. Thank you all for participating, and those who are still to play their matches in the coming days and weeks, good luck, and thank you to all of you that have participated so far.
Our wildlife needs help. Tourism to Africa is at an all-time low. You can assist by liking and sharing the conservation games. You can contribute financially by hitting the donate button on the Zambezia.com website. Let's get together and back up the frontline conservation team.